Thank you for coming today. We're very excited to welcome Matt Qing from the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California in Riverside. Matt is here at Weatherhead as a visiting researcher for the year. And although he's busy flying around North America giving book talks, just came down from Toronto. So the topic today is his new book, In the Forest of the Blind, the Eurasian Journey of Faxian's Record of Buddhist Kingdoms, published in March, right, of this year.
I think so, yeah.
2022,
Yep.
From Columbia University Press, as was his earlier book, Oceans of Milk, Oceans of Blood, a Mongolian monk in the ruins of the Qing. That was published in 2019. So Matt is keeping up a steady clip here, publishing, and many articles as well. But I wanted to point out that his earlier book won 3 awards, including the winner of the 2020 Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion at the American Academy of Religion. And I just want to draw attention to a few of his ongoing projects or past work. I think this one in particular should be of interest to us in Tibetan Studies, a 2017 Henry Luce Foundation ACLS program in China Studies collaborative reading workshop. We held one of these here at Columbia some years ago, and it was just incredibly helpful to have their support. But genealogies of knowledge, reading Xinyi and Topic literature from the Tibetan frontiers of late imperial China. And I mean, this is the kind of work that, we have a lot of these, right? And people don't generally, think through it. Maybe they read the one of the person that they're focused on, but they don't think through the kind of what this tells us about knowledge. So I'd be, if we have time in the Q&A section, be interested to see what you came up with in that study.
Yes.
And the other point that I would just want to introduce here is Matt's current project called Making the Present with the Gobi. And it's a transdisciplinary experiment working at the intersection of Buddhist studies, the history of science, environmental history, and the social history of knowledge. Which overlaps a lot with the ongoing research concerns that the Modern Tibetan Studies program here started by Evelyn Washul and continuing with Lauren and I, focusing on the environment and climate history and so forth. So another point that I would love to hear more about if we have time in the Q&A. But for now, we will hear about Matt's new book. And thank you again for coming.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Sure. Okay. Oh, mask here. Okay. Well, first, let me thank Gray for that very kind introduction and the opportunity to be at the Weatherhead this year, and for 1,000 other kindnesses over the years. And I've just written this. Oh, there we go. And also to Lauren for the opportunity to do this talk today, for you guys for being here. Let's just jump into it so we have lots of time for conversations afterwards. Critiques of Orientalism and reckoning with the colonial legacies of the human sciences are hardly new, yet to date, surprisingly few studies have tracked the reception of Orientalist texts and knowledge practices as these were exchanged and remade in Eurasia, into and out of European colonial formations, into and out of the epistemic sovereignty claimed by the West, and into and out of non-European and non-colonial frames. And so my book, which Gray kindly introduced, there we are, is an attempt to experiment with the doing of this kind of histories for Buddhist studies, working across Qing, French, Mongolian, Tibetan frames of reference. And the specific circulatory history I explore in this book focuses on interconnected projects across the 19th and 20th century to make sense of the ancient walking and witnessing of a 5th century Chinese monk named Faxian, who I'll introduce in a moment. This was a centralist exchange that made and unmade an entire humanist subfield in France, but which also made and unmade historical knowledge in the Qing Empire and made and unmade models of world historical order among Siberian, Mongolian, and Tibetan scholars and monks, weathering the violence of the revolutionary modern in Asia's heartland. And so this morning, I'll just introduce a little about this dispersed history, um, which is a sort of a history of field creation and of field erasure, a history that decenters the universalism and placelessness of the West then and today, in a way that I think this kind of history is full of possibility for a revisionist and even radical Buddhist studies and for the critical Asian humanities. So I'll circle back to that at the end here. But let me begin, as I do in the book, with a talk, a lecture in the May of 1830 at the Institut de France in Paris, where a much anticipated lecture is about to begin. So the savants of Paris whispered excitedly as they took their seats facing the empty podium. The speaker waiting to take the lectern was Jean-Pierre Abel-Remusat. Just over 40 years old, he was considered a master of the Orientalist's interpretive art. Those who gathered knew him as the first sinologist in France, even in Europe, in the modern sense of the term. We'll see these in a lot of histories of sinology in the note on Abel-Remusat. But by 1830, the time of this lecture, Abel-Remusat had distinguished himself for much more than sinology. In the language of fact and event, for decades, he had pioneered scholarly practices to discipline Buddhism, the Buddha, and Buddhists as objects of history, geography, and philosophy. Paris was then the global hub of systematic Orientalism, and at the center of its emerging Science de l'Orient Bouddhiste, the science of Buddhist Asia, as they like to call it, was Abel-Remusat, its master practitioner. And his first professional practitioner. In forums like the proceedings of the Société Asiatique or the pages of the Journal Asiatique, both of which he founded or was part of founding in 1822, Abel-Remusat had for decades mapped Buddhist Asia in what I call a new continent of possibility for Europe. Buddhist Asia was not a single or precise physical place. Its geography was not of the media of earth or water. Buddhist Asia, which had been disciplined in Abel-Remusat's scholarship, was an abstracted field of relations and associations among places. And from this newly imagined relational continent in Paris, Abel-Remusat's disciplinary practices extracted previously unknown moral and metaphysical resources. This is the language he uses, moral and metaphysical resources for the project of becoming modern in Europe. Controversially, among his critics, especially the Anglo-Orientalists, Abel-Remusat surveyed Buddhist Asia's slopes and spires not exclusively from Indian sources. In his field-building scholarship, Buddhist Asia wound across Central, Inner, and East Asian scripts and dusted texts, many of them previously unknown in Europe. Out of the primitive ether of the non-West, so sort of pre-Darwinian primitivism I have to explain in the book, I'm not going to get into it now, Abel-Remusat's methods set nations like Cambodia, Tibet, and Java into new analytic relation. This is what I mean by Buddhist Asia as sort of a continent of relations. One could think Cambodia in relation to Sri Lanka, in relation to Java, in relationship to Europe in new ways. Across their differences, they appeared now as sharing some deeply historical set of disciplines, ideas, and moral orders. Buddhism, on this pioneering scholar's mosaic-like view, was spread across Chinese sources as much as Sanskrit ones. The biography of the Buddha, which Abel-Remusat actually first presented to Europe, unfurled in Mongolian as much as in Pali, and the philosophy of Buddhism, which he helped show had surely originated in India, this was a debate at the time, could be illuminated only by rigorous comparison of interacting and connecting ideas, histories, literatures from across Asia. So many of those, we're still pretending we're in 1830 Paris here, many of those now seated in this lecture hall knew Abel-Remusat as a genius, a luminary who had established a scientific field single-handedly. In public writing and oration about him from the 1810s to the 1840s, he was often ranked next to Newton or Pascal as the individual wellspring of an entire field of science. This is the science of Buddhist Asia, the Science de l'Orient Bouddhiste. But closer examination of his published work, his letters, and the impressions of those who knew him reveal his depths. And this matters for the story I try to tell in this book. So the first reservoir of these practices, these new methods that he develops to know Buddhist Asia, come from the usual biblically derived philology that had been practiced in Europe for centuries. The second is a new systematic Orientalism really getting going in Paris, although there's kind of networks in Germany and in Russia and elsewhere, under the patronage of his mentor, Sylvestre de Sacy. He's a major topic in Said's Orientalism, for example. De Sacy is well known. He's Abbé Mousset's patron, and is sort of looming in the background of all that Abbé Mousset does. It was with de Sacy's mentorship that Abbé Mousset first undertook the study of Chinese and Manchu. In time, not only could he read Chinese and Tartar, Manchu, Mongol, Tibetan, but also he offered Europe some of its first systematic grammars of all these languages. He does offer the first systematic grammar of Chinese, or at least that is what he is celebrated for. And for this, he was appointed in 1814 to the Collège de France as the world's first research chair in, quote, les langues et littératures de Chine and Tartary Manchu. So in the languages and literatures of China and Tartary Manchu. It's completely in a Qing frame. This is how King Louis at the time, right in the shadow of the kind of Napoleonic era, still during all this upheaval, framed professional scholarship in this field. And this is also when they appoint a first professional scholar in Sanskrit that same year. However, Abbé Mousset's disciplining of Buddhist Asia had two other distant and rarely acknowledged sources. And it became very important in the course of research and writing this book to take these into account. First was a pre-Darwinian model of racialized and nationalized descent derived explicitly from the great German philosopher and mathematician Leibniz. Leibniz's project on universal characteristics, which understood all diversity as mirrored and relational, proposed that all differences could be translated into a single grammar. It was an explicit reference to Leibniz that between 1810 and 1830, Abbé Mousset and his closest colleagues invented Buddhist Asia as a vast continent of similitude overlaid by only superficial differences. So if you could read Cambodian or Manchu or Sanskrit and Tibetan and Manchu and Mongol, you could come up through all that sort of only apparent superficial difference to some sort of fundamental similitude, grammar, Buddhism, right? We still organize my department, some of our subfields are sort of still organized on some of these suppositions. Now, the other major wellspring, however, one very familiar to many of you in this room, for Abbé Mousset's Science of Buddhist Asia, came from polylingual reference works produced in the contemporary Qing Empire. As you guys know, the sovereignty of the Manchu ruling elite and the nature of Qing sovereignty was always sort of polylingual, polyethnic, in ways I don't need to explain here. And in the 18th century, many dictionaries, vocabularies, and other translation tools were published, for example, in the court of Qianlong, Faxian, and so on. These had been collected in the 18th century by French envoys, by missionaries, and by others in these networks. By the early 19th century, when Abbé Mousset was ascending the scholarly ranks in Paris, they existed by the dozen on the shelves of the Bibliothèque Royale, the sort of precursor to the BNF in Paris, the National Library. And indeed, Abbé Mousset in 1824 was appointed as conservator of manuscripts, precisely in these libraries. Now, the debt that Abbé Mousset owed to Manchu sources and Qing ways rather, of sort of constructing similitude and difference come very explicitly, there's an example, from his handwritten notes, which are in the archives of the BNF. This is Abbé Mousset's handwriting from when he's a student, what I think around 1810 or 1811, even before he's appointed, literally drawing equivalencies around Buddha, Burhan, so on and so on. Like all that. This is his handwriting, drawing equivalencies by the dozen pages and pages and pages and pages. He later publishes a little bit about this. And before he dies in 1832, in fact, he planned as the sort of apex of his scholarship in Buddhist Asia to publish with Eugene Burnoff, who writes the famous history of Indian Buddhism, who's one of kind of a student of his, in this scene, they wanted to publish and translate many of these Qing encyclopedias as the sort of like stamp on the science of Buddhist Asia, and to add Latin as well. And in the language they use, because this would open opportunities for for metaphysics and ethics in Europe. That's how they specifically understood this. So, right. So from this, from these Qing sources explicitly, he poached a comprehensive view of the form, languages, organizing concepts, and equivalencies of Buddhist Asia, sort of pushed through a Leibnizian frame of racialized dissent and similitude and indifference in the sort of new Orientalism of Dasasi in this world in the 1810s, 20s, and 30s. Okay, and so for all these reasons, imagine we're still in this lecture hall in Paris, or I'm keeping us here, you're not allowed to leave, that half of, for this reason that that the halls of this hall at the Institut de France was so crowded, hushed, and expectant, he was famous. Albert Musset was famous for all this. Here he clears his throat, arranges his notes, and fills the quiet of this long ago May. He's about to announce his work, his new book project. And this is where my book kind of begins. After welcoming the audience and thanking his host, Albert Musset announced that his lecture would share preliminary findings from a not yet written book. His topic was a Chinese text as remarkable as it was enigmatic. He had first discovered it, in fact, in an 18th century Qing imperial compilation. Upon examination, Albert Musset had identified the text as a turn of the 5th century travel account written by Faxian. Faxian had been a monk of the Eastern Jin dynasty who had been much disturbed by the incomplete state of the Vinaya, or the canon in general, and the Vinaya specifically. He had been concerned about the scarcity, without any sure textual firmament, dedicated Chinese monks like Faxian, the close of the 4th century, lived their disciplined lives with an uncertain connection to the Buddha's long ago example. And so Albert Musset announced, in the year 399, when he was about 62 years old, Faxian departed westward from the city of Chang'an in search of Vinaya texts. Faxian's destination was Tianzhu, roughly what we would today call India, and what Albert Musset recognized definitively as the wellspring of Buddhism. At the close of the 4th century, India was mostly terra incognita in Chinese thought and letters, just as it was among those Orientalist scholars gathered in Paris 14 centuries later. Following the perilous chains of exchange connecting the Ganges River basin to China, Faxian hoped he could retrieve Vinaya and kind of repair a Chinese Buddha proto-canon. And he did. He completes this precarious passage in about 14 years. There's debate about this, but something like that. Along the way, studying Sanskrit and collecting needed records of the Buddhist speech. Upon his return, Faxian wrote an account of his travels. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, which 14 centuries later, a Manchu imperial court had compiled, and then a French envoy collected, and later this master Orientalist he's now announcing, deciphered. How remarkable. Albert Musset reminded his audience that no scholar in Europe had ever guessed that Indic languages and traditions had been known or studied in China, nor among pre-Mohammedan or Islamic Buddhist societies in Asia's heartland. Faxian offered an eyewitness account of language and ideas and disciplines moving between China and what he identified as the Mongolian, Tibetan, and Turkic societies ringing the Tarim Basin, Asia's heartland there, into the valleys and mountains of what we today call Afghanistan and Pakistan, and into the worlds of South Asia. Faxian, furthermore, had come into the presence and monuments marking the time and place of the historical Buddha, already 1,000 years dead by his arrival. When subjected to Albert Musset's scientific methods, Faxian's ancient walking traced lines around the physical, moral, and metaphysical contours of that great invention of post-Napoleonic Orientalism, Buddhist Asia. Okay, so affirming a shared faith in the progressive trajectory of Orientalist knowledge, to loud applause, Albert Musset vows that he will soon have this masterwork of his young science in print, and he leaves the lectern. Okay, and see, so it's very dramatic doing this. Okay, and it did. Not, but it does come out in print, but not until this sort of luminary of the Orientalists died in the Great Cholera pandemic of 1832. Two of his colleagues bring it into print and is published in 1836. The thing that matters for the book that I wrote, and the story I'm about to tell is kind of where things really get going in, for my book, is that the translation of the Chinese text takes up only about 50 pages in the French. There are 450 pages of annotations. Anyone that's reading 19th century Orientalism will be unsurprised, right? Abbé Musset and his editors explicitly and triumphantly fill the remaining of these hundreds of extra pages with a fevered annotation. Entire subfields of natural philosophy hang from nearly every Chinese noun in French translation. And this text is an immediate sensation. Within a decade of its publication, however, Abbé Musset was already being forgotten for his field-building work in Europe. His poached methods were so quickly and universally adopted as to become invisible. His institution building was soon disregarded, and his pioneering insights were eclipsed by his successors. Really, there's a transition to a more Indo-centrism that had been favored by the Anglo-Orientalists, and especially with Eugene Burnouf taking over his posts in Paris. This earlier wild work, kind of looking to basically at Buddhist Asia through Qing frames, is kind of muted for quite some time. Okay, but here's the point of my book. I did not write this book to correct the record. The imperfect memory of normative intellectual history does not concern me, and I'm not motivated to offer readers another example of Buddhism made or discovered in colonial Europe. While Abbé Musset held aloft his interpretation of Faxian's record as the sort of apex of his disciplinary work, my book is interested in looking at the sources and shadows of its pages to see how his science and the very notion of Buddhist Asia as a continent of possibility for Europe was unmade and silenced in Eurasianist exchange. My book very intentionally rejects the linear vision of field history and looks instead for global histories of field erasure in the humanities. And so, to find that story, I needed to follow the play of silence and speech between Paris and the polylingual courts of the Qing Empire, the nascent Siberian Academy, like in Kazan, St. Petersburg, so on, the Mongolian Buddhist monastic colleges in Ikhri, right? And actually, the story ends in some of the earliest historical writing that happens in the Tibetan refugee settlements in the 1960s in India, where Faxian matters for contextualizing the recent experience of Tibetan refugees to sort of to fit with a historical frame the crisis and the loss of basically the crisis of time, community, and territory represented by events with the PLA beginning in 1959, especially in the 1950s. Okay, so let me just quickly give you a sense of some of these guys here, and then I'll just sort of begin concluding so we can have a discussion. So one of the major guys, though, that I am kind of feel very strongly about talking about a little bit, these Buryat guys, or we need to think more about these guys, is Dorji Banzarov, a fascinating but little known figure in the intellectual history of Russia and in the Asian circuit of the humanities and social science into Asia in the 19th century. Banzarov was a Siberian loyalist to the Tsarist court and one of the first Asian Russian subjects to be trained in European scholarly practices like ethnology and philology. Like Abbé Musset, Banzarov was a disciplinary pioneer. And it's just something to note in passing, he produces the first ethnology of Siberian shamanism, a concept still found in the World Religion textbook. He really kind of introduces the concept of shamanism, especially in relationship to Buddhism as a way of thinking about inter-Asian society, something that Chris Atwood always laments, that Banzarov kind of gave us this terrible legacy that we need to overcome, thinking about Buddhism and shamanism in two breaths. There's two different things. Okay. And so as part of this sort of Tsarist-sponsored, court-sponsored trajectory, in the 1850s, Banzarov began translating European work, and then he eventually gets Abbé Musset's French translation of the Chinese record. which he translates as here, the record, so the record of how the teaching spread into Buddhist teaching spread into Mongolian lands. This is how it appears in classical Mongolian, not sort of a more contemporary Buryati script, something very intentionally into this sort of canonical, like literary languages of High Mongolian literature, as this was understood at the time. And so I translate this, I should mention, I translate the Mongolian and the Tibetan versions of Faxian's record. There are appendixes in the book, which I'm hoping will kind of be of interest in the classroom and stuff here. So this brought Faxian's famous 5th century text for the first time into the Republic of Inter-Asian Letters. So Xuanzang's later travel, the Southern Chinese pilgrim in the Tong, his account had been translated in Tibetan by Gombojap, right? The author of the Gyeonak Chujung in the 18th century, late 18th century, right? Gombojap. But Faxian had been all but unknown in Mongolian or Tibetan letters until this time. Okay, so another figure in this circuit is the one who was the protagonist of my first book, Lobsang Damden or Zawa Damden. He's the Hakka Buddhist abbot from Outer Mongolia and a grand theorist of Qing imperial history, religion, and politics, right as the Qing collapses in the early 20th century. And for the first 25 years of experiments in state socialist building in Mongolia. In 1917, Zawa Damden completed a heavily annotated Tibetan translation, a Banzara's Mongolian translation, of Abel Musset's French translation of the Chinese. Which I also, this is the main thing that I kind of offer this full translation of this text in the book as well. And it is, these, by the way, these are wildly different texts, I should say. They become very much their own things, as I'll say in a minute. In Zawa Damden's hands, Abel Musset's humanist work now thoroughly becomes a piece of Inter-Asian monastic chronicle, heavily annotated with Qing and Tibetan scholastic and Indian scholastic references, Kalachaka Abhidharma, Liu Langrulung Temple, like prophetic literature, all kinds of Namtar, all these kinds of things. And Faxian, in Tibetan letters, Faxian's witnessing unravels a deep history of Inter-Asian Buddhism, of what they call Tibetan and Mongolian peoples and politics that had previously been unknown in their monastic literary worlds. So now, once I had connected these texts together and these disciplinary traditions and so on, I've sort of felt compelled to think about them, not in the mode of impact or influence. There's no colonial relationship here, right? There's no political, and basically there's no reference to each other. There's absolutely no reference from one interpretive site to the other in any sustained way. And I think that this becomes much more, it's sort of a mode of refusal and silencing. It's making out of the silencing of interpretation made elsewhere. And I think, this is what I came to think, that this is an example of what Prasanjit Dwara calls circulatory history, which I develop in a kind of Deleuzian, Guattarian frame as this uncensored becoming of knowledge that defies the universal and which rejects civilizational narratives and exclusivist forms of epistemic sovereignty. The story doesn't begin with the West and end up in the non-West here. This is a kind of refusal of what I wanted to call, just to make things simple, kind of anti-field history. And the work of this, I came to realize, is to illuminate that raw plane of combination, connection, and exchange that made and unmade the disciplinary practices of Buddhist and Asian studies, but also of Qing-inflected global historical orders, and the time and place of Mongolian and Tibetan experiences of, for example, socialism or the refugee diasporas and all that. Okay. Maybe I'm going to skip going into two examples too deeply, and I'll just kind of quickly talk about what each of these guys are most interested in, and then I can return to them just so we have time for conversation. So as Abel Musset in France, and his colleagues published this, this text, topics of basically what they're most interested in sort of proving over the shoulder of Faxian are a series of debates that were then open in philosophy, geography, and history. Philosophy, unlike the interpretations of Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche later, and all of whom, by the way, are reading Albert Musset's work and are very influenced by it. Albert Musset finds in Faxian's writing a species of like Buddhist idealism that was otherwise kind of ignored or maybe overlooked in this German embrace of this philosophy of like nicht, right, of nothingness, and where Buddhism becomes paradigmatic for these movements in 19th century continental philosophy. But in the details, Albert Musset is going through trying to give the first, what he considers systematic scientific account of ideas like bodhicitta, shunyata, the three jewels, arhats, bodhisattvas. What is extinguished when the Buddha had achieved his parinirvana? Like paragraphs long, systematic, deep thinking in reference to Rousseau, of course, Leibniz, all these other, many other people, right? And ethics. So for Albert Musset, Faxian's eyewitnessing, when subjected through to this analytical treatment, provides this vast new resource for metaphysics and ethics. This is the language that he and those around him are constantly using. And I deal with this extensively in the book, and I can circle back in case anyone's interested in that. In matters of geography, just the fact that China and India had been historically connected culturally, economically, in terms of literature and all the rest, as early as Faxian's walking was revolutionary, was mind-blowing at the time among Europeans. But also, Faxian's walking spatializes the life of the Buddha. It offers the first account of the Buddha did this there, and he did that there, he was born there, he died, because Faxian visits all these places. And so this was hot debates in European Orientalism at the time. Prevailing theories were that the Buddha had been a kinky-haired Ethiopian, he had been an Egyptian, or he was an avatar of Mercury or Thor. Including the Anglo-Orientalists at the time, who are the sort of other comparable scientific Orientalists, are holding fast to the African theory origin for the Buddha. So Albert Musset's work, reading all these sources against one another, and sort of really sealed by this book on Faxian, gives Europe its account of really where the Buddha lived, what he taught, and again, all these historical relations. And also, he develops a sort of historical chronology of Buddhism spreading out of India, the central lands of India, Matadesa, in different waves. That he's also trying to explain what is Hinayana versus Mahayana, all these kind of references that Faxian's making on the fly, that Albert Musset's always saying, like, he's just writing to other people who know what he's talking about, and poor me, I need to work all this stuff out, and so on and so forth. So history, philosophy, geography, this is the content of those 450 pages of natural philosophy hanging from Faxian's work. Now we can imagine once this enters into Inner Asia, into Mongolian Tibetan letters, they're not quite as concerned at all. They know what the Buddha taught, they think. They have very clear ideas, of course. High Gelug scholasticism in Tibet, Mongolia, Siberia certainly has its own developed positions about what the Buddha taught, what he meant, what he really meant, what he did when and where. None of this was challenged so much by Faxian's record. Really, a primary topic of concern is to deepen, to reimagine the deep history of Mongolian and Tibetan communities, the deep history of their supposed claim on the Buddhist dispensation, and then through that to sort of rewrite their own version of the early dispensation, right? The Ngadar gets completely reimagined through the Faxian's, right? And this needs to be understood as a sort of chapter of that long history that had begun with people like Gombojab and all these boundary crossing Doa Mongol folks that Gray studied and others, who are basically trying to account for Chinese Manchu sources along Tibetan Mongolian ones. Faxian in Dalai hands just blows open that, just really opens that up even more, extends the vision that had previously been written. And that's why it's so meaningful for scholars like Ngawan Nima, who is a Buryat who escaped the Soviets and goes to Mongolia. Then he escapes the Mongol socialists. He goes to Lhasa. Then he escapes the Chinese, and he's writing the first Chujung, the first monastic history it's published in 1965 in South India. That is called the Chujung Lumi Dunme, the lamp illuminating scripture and reasoning. it opens its story not with the story of the Tibetan Sempos, not with the Qing emperors, not with whatever, not with even the Buddha. It starts with Faxian walking across Eurasia. That becomes the widest historical frame for these Tibetan refugee monks to frame all that had been lost in community history and space. Okay, so yeah, and I'm happy to jump into any of these things. So I mean, there's so many examples that basically these Mongol and Tibetan guys are also kind of reading footnotes, and out of the mistakes of Abel Humusat and some of the crazy guesses, including of his colleagues who start doing wild annotations after his death, about, well, that reference must be to Uyghurs, and that must be to Mongols, that must be to Tibetans. Like basically, they kind of do half the work for these Eurasians, who then in Mongolian and Tibetan basically confirm all of that in the body of the translation. So in Mongolian and Tibetan, if you look at the translations there in the book, Faxian's meeting Uyghurs, Mongols, he's walking by Tibetan mountains, he's in India encountering Burn people and all this kind of stuff. It becomes, Faxian is patronized or walking through Buddhist societies that were patronized by Mongol princes and all this stuff, right? Kind of what we might expect, but it's done out of the footnoting, its own kind of erasure of French humanism, just as that French humanism had been built out of Qing, the sort of poaching from and also silencing of Qing intellectual kind of tools and techniques. Okay, so let me conclude, and then maybe we can just chat if anything here is interesting. So yeah, over the course of my teaching and writing of this book, my organizing questions really changed considerably. I began wishing, I started out wishing to sort of append a previously unstudied Inter-Asian chapter to all the scholarship that's out there about Faxian and his record in East Asia. However, I eventually realized that thinking these materials in relation to one another was an opportunity for a far wider project. And actually, Johan Elverskog really encouraged me to think about it this way. This project, this bigger project, which I tried to do in this book, was to trace this centralist circulatory history about the ecologies of interpretation that include the making of humanist knowledge, but also its unmaking, and to sort of think about what would maybe count as anti-field history in approaching these sorts of sources in relationship to one another, and definitely outside of linearity, impact, and influence as such. And I think there's lots of disciplinary possibility, maybe widely in Asian studies, but I think especially for Buddhist studies, to repurpose Saidiya Hartman's phrasing, the result is to, quote, illuminate the contested character of history, narrative, event, and fact, to topple the hierarchy of discourse and to engulf authorized speech in a clash of voices, end quote. This has been done a lot by historians of like the Black Atlantic, for example. I mean, Walter McNolo has looked at this Renaissance culture in Latin America. I think it's very timely and very full of possibility to be thinking about this in Inter-Asia and perhaps in Asia more widely, a little bit more. And so by this experiment, I hope that more scholars of the critical Asian humanities and in Buddhist studies and Tibetan studies might begin to imagine as part of their disciplinary identity, the requirement to have answers to Kwanzaa Chen's vital de-imperializing question. Why is Asia always an object, but never a generative condition for theory and methodological innovation in the humanities? Some good answers, I think, are to be found in the circulatory histories, such as this one case study that I look at in this book. There are surely thousands of others that we could look at. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Open the floor, questions. Yeah, and let me get this microphone on and hand it around to the people at the on Zoom.
Thank you for the talk. I'm intrigued.
Thank you.
And I'm Nolan Benz. I'm a senior religion here. I love the way that you sort of drew comparisons and equivalencies between us in a seminar room and the French scholars in their seminar room, right? But I hope you don't mind, but I want to ask a kind of a tough question.
Please.
It's not meant to be confrontational. It's for the benefit of the other students in the room.
Yeah, let's go. Be tough. That's great. Yeah.
So the people who Abu Remasat,
Abel Musset. So let me put their names up so you guys can see them as we go. Yep.
I just don't know French. So
No, it's okay. I'm slurring it myself. No worries.
sorry. The Qing scholars who he was referencing, you used the word poach,
Mhm.
but I have two questions, I guess.
Yes.
One is, didn't he cite them? Didn't he say where he got the information?
Yeah.
And then, so were they were also scholars, right? But then let's go all the way back. Faxian was a scholar, and his audience for his text were scholars.
Uh-huh.
So the question I have is, what was he doing with that text? And what were his audience taking from that text?
What was Faxian doing with that text?
Yeah, in the 400s.
Yeah. Sure. Those are great questions. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm using poach as a shorthand in this presentation, but I'm using it, and I talk about this in the book, in this Michel de Certeau's sense of poaching. Reading is poaching. It's like a family, so I mean, here the idea is that basically, like, in fact, he starts that essay standing on top of the World Trade Center in New York, looking down at the streets of Manhattan. Is that right? Where he'd be looking at? Sorry, I don't know New York. And he's looking at all of these streets, right? And he's like, one way of thinking about the complex intersection of places and power and subjects and all the rest of what you're looking at is to pay attention to signs and stoplights, streets, one way, this way, that way, whatever, right? But then look at what people are doing. They're jaywalking, walk in New York, right? They're jaywalking, they're jumping the fare, they're they're going the wrong way, they're riding bikes, they're skateboarding, they're doing whatever, right? They're in the sewers, they're in the up at the top of the building. So his point is that there are strategies and tactics by which all of our lives are made. One are sort of like systems that are out there, how we arrange ourselves in this room, how a text is laid out, but then there's the reality of how we ourselves move through them. And of course, this is a response to the sort of critique that Foucault was too structuralist. Michel de Certeau was his student, right? And it becomes like a really important trend in cultural histories of reading and social histories of knowledge, which I'm kind of working at in this book, performance theory and all that, to think about that way, because even as we move through like our eyes are darting on the page, you guys are all, we're all hearing just what we pick up on and all that stuff. So by poaching, the idea is simply that he's taking what is most useful. I mean, this is what we're trained to do in our disciplines, of course.
Right, not misusing it, but
No.
using it.
Sorry, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it just becomes shorthand for basically how all knowledge is made, essentially, which I find true and is very useful in thinking about this book. And he does reference his sources, but in ways that won't be surprising. Of course, that his strategy is to situate himself as extending this grand Enlightenment traditions, including of Leibniz and Rousseau and all this stuff. And you do see scattered references to the Tartar conquerors of China, as he puts it. It's really in the archives in his notes, which thankfully were survived, that we see his debt, actually. And also his proclamations that he was going to circle back to these Qing sources, like the Pentaglot dictionaries, and try to offer a suggestion.
I like that too, that people were dying of the pandemic then, and they are now too.
Oh, I'll tell you, I wrote this book during COVID in my garage with my 7-year-old doing grade 2 next to me, just thinking about him dying. And I found like his wife's record of him dying. It was just like so intense, for sure.
Well, you track in the book that it started in West Bengal and traveled all the way
Yeah.
across Russia. I mean, it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is wild times. And it also kills the Sanskritist who had been hired with him as well. I mean, basically this generation was wiped out.
Okay, but back to Faxian, there
Yeah.
were constantly like
Yes.
long before the period.
Mhm.
So he was braving all those things himself
Yeah, that's
At
right.
62.
at 60.
Yeah, it's remarkable.
Why do that? And why,
Yes.
and regardless of why he did it, how did the monks who read the book receive it?
Yeah, thank you. That's also an excellent question. And I do try to talk about that. There's some scholars that have done this work, and I try to just summarize their work. But Well, one thing to think of is that, of course, those scholars are keen to point out is that this isn't a pilgrimage in some Christian-derived sense. This is not a transit, a transportio, I think, as one scholar puts it. So this is about going and retrieving texts and coming back. It's explicitly about this for Faxian and for others like him. And it sort of fits into this like staged history of Buddhism coming into China that John Kieschnick and others have written about, where there's still this sort of like, you know, the problem of interpreting, of producing an authoritative canon in China, required having like a spatial relationship ultimately to Western places and Western peoples. I mean, if you had well, they include, or India. Yeah, right.
But not Europe.
No, sorry. Yeah, so like having a Sogdian or a Turkic or a Khotanese or an Indian monk in your circle in Chang'an or something, that as you're trying to, you know, figure out which version of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra is going to be our authoritative one, how do we translate, you know, whatever, this technical term into Chinese. This was sort of the project, and it's happening in huge workshops. It's actually really interesting. So when Faxian gets back to China after this perilous sea journey, and he kind of like salt logged, like struggles out of the ocean, essentially, he's kind of taken up by these regional governors and all that. And soon enough, he's brought into these really famous workshops, translation workshops and textual production focused monasteries. And there's a scholar, a few scholars who have looked at like what those might have looked like. We don't know in the case of Faxian specifically, but we know exactly how those workshops were operating in other ways around that same time. And the theory is Faxian would have sat in the center of a big room of up to a couple hundred people, possibly. There would have been the abbot, all these scholars and translators, and there would have been representatives of the Western regions, like, you know, Central Asian, South Asians. And Faxian would have spoken the story or read from his notes or whatever. And they would have collectively put together the Fuguoji, what we now know as the record of Buddhist kingdoms. And people would have debated and said, oh, no, that's, you know, like Bodh Gaya is not there, or Rajgir is over there, you know what I mean? Like how, whatever. And so there, and then of course, also like, it seems clear that many multiple versions of this text circulated. But by Abel Muset's time, there's a version he sees in this Qianlong compilation, a kind of a bunch of excerpts. And then the longer one that he knows, which is also the one in the Taisho canon and all that, they're all pretty aligned. So yeah, no, it is. And I kind of think a lot about that, those resonances. Of course, we have to think about the dissonances as well, but I think that's why they're so legible. And actually that becomes a major topic of Abel Muset's reflection in his translation, is he really goes far into seeing Faxian as like a proto-Orientalist. He calls him a proto-Orientalist, right? Well, true. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's right. Damn, I should have said that. You're right, totally. But he uses the word a critic of Buddhist Asia, a critic of Buddhist Asia. In other words, a textualist, a comparativist, and then, you know, kind of like a positivist in some ways, but also embedded in communities of knowledge. And that's really important as we're thinking about social history of knowledge. Like, also going back to Michel de Salto, what are interpretive sites, interpretive operations and techniques, permissions and prohibitions that were known in these individual places? And that's why that really is the oil that gets this whole circulation going in abundant ways. Yeah. No, thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Matt. Wonderful presentation. I look forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
You mentioned a term, pre-Darwinian primitivism, and another term, this vast continent of similitude. And you don't have to fully define these terms for us or anything, but one question I have is, it's probably well established that Abel Musat is working within this context of trying to find origins, which probably speaks to why there's this shift to India. You also mentioned that Dorje, Bandarov, and Lobsang Dandin were concerned with the Nada, right, with this early dissemination of Buddhism. And so one question I have for you, how do these ideas about origins, about beginnings, how are they received by these Tibetan and Mongolian thinkers?
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I'll say really quickly that pre-Darwinian primitivism is interesting to me. I don't want to. Okay. Well, I mean, like, we teach in religion departments, right? So you teach Mechanism theory, usually start with these social Darwinians, right? You're teaching Freud, Tyler, Marx, whatever, all these guys, and notions of these grand evolutionary schemes of human difference that, of course, always end up with like white educated men in Europe, like them, and so on and so forth. But the point is that actually, so in that, the notions of the primitive religion, primitive magic, primitive philosophers, become part of these grand stories of basically religion fading away and science, qua Europe, kind of becoming this, the ruling this modern age or whatever, that whole story. This is decades before Darwin. I mean, Abakle Musat's not working this, but there's another sense of the primitive that really matters actually for how this whole construct of Buddhist Asia was developed. And this is the primitive in the sense of like that the originary, a kind of like ether in which all these sort of like tropes and ideas, like Mercury, Thor, the Buddha, were all kind of like in the background. They were placeless. They were all sort of expressions of basically of things that Europe already knew. This is the important point. And there's an excellent book called The Cult of Nothingness that looks, and I'm really afraid, is a French author who is incredible and whose name is escaping me right now. But the book is called The Cult of Nothingness. He's looking at basically, oh yes, thank you. Yes, exactly. So how basically the continental philosophers and others like took up this notion of Buddhism as philosophy of nothingness. But he does this incredible, in my opinion, a really great job for outsiders like me about what was this primitiveness out of which, in which earlier Europeans were kind of imagining Buddhism, Buddhist doctrine, all this. And the point, though, the one that matters for this text is that like we don't even have to do the work about what's the Buddha somewhere or not. Like it's enough. Like call him Mercury over there, call him Buddha over there. These are just like kind of bubblings up of some like cauldron of like primitive soup that we already can recognize, right? And therefore we already can know and command in the sort of 18th century Orientalist frame ideas like little rumblings that some Jesuit in Japan writes back about, the Buddha statue, or some, Capuchin and, wherever, is writing about, some doctrine of Buddhism, some idiosyncratic ritual text that they write back. It's kind of, it's placeless and timeless is kind of the take. And so Abakle Musat is really intentionally writing against that. That's why you see capital H history, capital G geography, capital P philosophy across everywhere. He's claiming in that spirit of early 19th century Paris, he's claiming in the language of fact and event, he's claiming the status of a science. And specifically a science of Buddhist Asia. I mean, he's using this language. It's so interesting, I think. And so that's where this idea of similitude and difference kind of comes in. And that's just his way of doing this work in reference to Leibniz, which we don't often think of in the history of Buddhist studies, but in my reading of Abakle Musat, he's everywhere. He himself understands what he's doing and those around him as extending a Leibnizian project. And basically that's the root of like comparative textual comparison. For him, that was really providing a logic for like reading Manchu sources against Tibetan sources, against Chinese sources, against Cambodian ones, thinking about all these places as somehow connected, even across all their apparent superficial differences, because fundamentally there is something called Buddhism, les Buddhistes, and le Buddha back in the background. And knowing and getting to that similitude below all those differences is part of his field building. There's a few of us that have these languages and these scientific skills, techniques, and there's many that don't. He's constantly exiling those scholars and those who he thinks are frauds away and keeping those close to him. And interestingly, although in an unacknowledged way, there's all these Qing kind of Tibetan Manchu kind of like scholars who have produced all these reference works, which are kind of in the background. They're kind of in the circle, although never really acknowledged in ways we would expect. So in terms of the origins, though, just very briefly, like the Madar stuff, I mean, like, as you know, I mean, this is an ongoing project in the, of course, in the 18th and the 19th centuries in this sort of in Eurasian Buddhist worlds, right? And what does it mean to write Mongolian genealogy into Chujung, into Logyu, into monastic chronicle, right? What happens when we start having the Manchu emperors in there and Chinese records, right? I mean, this is all happening around, many generations before. So people like Tukin Chokinima, Simpa Kempo, Gungopoja, all these kind of crisscrossing, boundary crossing, boundary maintaining polylingual scholars of the 18th and 19th century are the explicit references for those receiving and making sense of Faxian's record here in the 19th and early 20th century. And those models of world historical order are, of course, the Gelug and the Qing kind of like partnership is the apex of not just something like Chi or Si, but it's of history itself. And this just provides like the back end of that. So like the Qing, kind of a couple centuries really, the Qing models of sovereignty as that were being worked out in Eurasian monastic literature was really kind of the end, the apex, the now. Works like Faxian's, as well as alongside Mongol genealogical records and other sort of sundry Chinese and other literature about the deep history, start filling in the back end. And also, by the way, this isn't unique. I mean, lots of these guys are reading reports about Silk Road excavation. They're in contact with Chinese diplomats, or like with Rock Hill, like think of Aglan Dorjiev, you know what I mean? Like Zawa Damdin, I explore my first book, I mean, he's talking about Turkic origins of the Mongols based on 19th century Orientalism. And what does that mean for the Kala Chakra? Like that's his concern. So Faxian's just part of that Faxian's record rather, as it finally arrives in Tibetan letters. And you'll see if you look at the appendix, you'll see how that's true. I mean, it's heavily supplemented, just as the French one was, by references to the Abhidharma, the Kala Chakra, and a small set of prophetic literature that has to do with Khotan, or he thinks it does. And also like all these other kinds of things. Yeah, so it's really that back end starts mattering. And of course, it really starts mattering once there's socialists knocking at the monastic gates in Hakha, in Irkutsk, eventually in Tibet, like, the state socialist forces starting to talk about like, hey, what are we teaching in the monastic courtyard right now? You know what I mean? Like what's, and specifically is what I looked at my first book, but it's here as well. Like, what are alternatives to this emergent national subject, a nationalist kind of like project, a way of thinking about history and community? These texts are working in different frames at the same time. And it becomes, which is why in the Tibetan refugee settlements in 1960, like Ngawan Nima is reading this stuff and starting the Chijunglunik Dume with Faxian Walks West from Chang'an. And that somehow is setting him and everyone else in this tuberculous, TB, saturated settlements in this really dire situation really early on with a meaningful sense of time and history. So it really matters in the context of the violence and the upheaval of the 20th century for Siberian, Mongolian, and Tibetan communities. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think it's just, yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you so much for your book.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Just came back from Chicago where I did a talk related to Japanese
No kidding.
actually the maps that are in this book.
Oh, yeah.
And I was reading your book on it right on the way back.
Yeah.
Very excited on people to go through it.
Oh, that's great.
So I bumped up into this weird historical moment from another direction. This is sort of an extended footnote that never made it into a book I just finished on the history of the Japanese Buddhist world,
Yes.
which ends up in Riverisade's translation, which, as you know, is a collaborative posthumous project
Yes.
by Riverside and Clapwell and Landres,
Yes.
as you described in the book.
Yes.
And as you well know, there's a number of maps
Yes.
in that book,
Yes.
including and you just, I haven't gotten to that point, but I did see that you produced some of the maps of particular Buddhist sites that Clapwell drew.
I did. Yes.
For the Faxian's translation, and he also reproduces, actually redraws, translates into French, and reinscribes Svensson's pilgrimage onto a map that he says comes from a Japanese
Okay,
source,
right.
which
think
is.
Maybe you had that up in your slide, right?
Is that the one that I have?
Yeah,
I
right
don't.
before Max came.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
There it
I
is.
recognized it from your book.
Yeah.
So I'm forgetting that this came from Japan. That's so cool. This is the
Yeah,
coolest
so
map in the
this-
book.
this
Yeah.
comes from the Wakan, which is a Japanese encyclopedia. of
Get outta here.
Volumes, which is based on the Sansai Way,
Huh.
which is a Chinese encyclopedia of a century earlier,
What?
which does not include this map because this map is a small version of a much larger map that was published in that was drawn and published in Japan in 1710
Uh-huh.
and actually gets that gets translated and redrawn and published in Stanislaus Lien's translation
Uh-huh.
of Xuanzang.
Yeah.
A couple decades later.
Yeah.
Anyway, so blah blah blah.
That's so cool.
So one of the things that I found very interesting, besides all the boring, history of the paper trail of this Japanese map and how it gets into Paris in the 19th century,
Mhm.
forever,
Yeah.
is the fact that for me, one of the things I found most interesting about the history of this map in, say, Edo period Japan, is that this Buddhist world map, which exists, I mean, at the center, I don't know if you described that, but that's Lake Anabataka.
Yeah,
Center,
yeah.
or great neighbors circling around. So this all comes out of Buddhist cosmology that's described in the opening fascicle of Xuanzang's pilgrimage, where he's paraphrasing Vasubandhu's government.
Yeah.
And then this appears in this like greatest scientific work of Buddhist studies.
Yeah.
That in the Edo period, this map, as it appears both in the publication cartography and even in the source that Klapot is drawing from, this Japanese encyclopedia, which includes not only the Japanese Buddhist world map, but also includes Matteo Ricci's world map, right? Operates in a realm of cartographic pluralism, which, for our understanding of early modernity shouldn't be the case. But it's very much the logic of the sort of encyclopedic imagination of Edo period Japan, and I think Qing and Qing China as well. And the fact that what I was really surprised by was that sort of inclusive, accumulative, encyclopedic logic that was not exclusionary or in any way teleological.
Yes.
Seems to be quite similar to the methodology of these early Orientalists, like Klapot and Abel Velusa.
Yes.
And Stanislav Julian, at least.
Yes.
Because Klapot, I guess, who's making the decision when he's editing this volume, right, which comes out after he died.
Yeah, he dies halfway
Is
between
that
the.
he includes this incredibly bizarre Japanese Buddhist world,
Yeah.
as well as the most scientifically precise
Yeah.
version of his own map.
Yeah.
Of Buddhist Asia, where he inscribes Faxian's pilgrimage. And as you know, Klapot is a great cartographer,
He sure is.
an explorer of these regions
Yeah.
as well as yet a third kind of map that he draws. And sure enough, in Julian's translation of, and this is actually the second version of the Wakan Samsai version of this map that Klapot draws.
Oh.
He did a version 10 years earlier
No way.
that he lectured on in Berlin.
Oh.
Blah, blah, blah. But even in the Stanislaus Julien version, where he publishes a much larger and more precise version of the Japanese original, he also has William Saint Martin produce this even more scientific,
Oh.
right? And Saint Martin writes about both the Japanese map of 1710 and his own map. That they're recognizing the value and the sort of the cultural historical value of multiple ways of seeing and multiple ways of representing Buddhist history, which they recognize as a spatial history, but their kind of scholarship is embodying a similar kind of non-reductionist historiography that seems to be echoing qualities that I'm seeing in, in Ming and Edo period encyclopedism. That it's not something that, say, in Buddhist studies or Asian studies or history or historiography, continue to carry out, in the Western tradition. And I'm wondering if that's something that you found, or if that's something that you see carried into the Mongolian and Tibetan reinterpretations, or whether you think the Mongolian and the Tibetan readers are doing something different with it, because they have a very specific, cultural agenda. That is quite different from these other.
No, it's amazing. And also, it's also really nice to meet you. I've been following your work for a long time, and I'm excited about this book. Actually, I've been waiting to read it. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for those questions. Two things come to mind, maybe, which is one, that I do think there is like an 18th century world, philological world. Well, it's not, I don't need to think this, it's true, and people have been publishing it on it recently, like, I'm forgetting his name, the world of Manchu philology, like these sort of like connected worlds of trying to make sense of Manchu in South China, Japan, Europe, especially in the worlds of, speaking of encyclopedic impulses, the kind of worlds of Diderot, just before Albert Musset. And these guys who were giving, producing the first alphabets of Manchu typeset in the encyclopedia, it's like making sense of Manchu was a way of making sense of China in all of these different cultural contexts. And that's really circulating and is interconnected in the 18th century, right in the background here. So there's like a philological impulse. And I heard from Devin Fitzgerald, that there's some people working right now on the sort of global effects of Qing court projects that register as philology and some of the encyclopedic impulses right now, that like out in all the stuff we're all seeing, right? We're pulling a little string here and everything else is moving. But so there's that. But one thing that is maybe to the heart of your question about these specific kind of Mongolian and Tibetans is that there are those who are employed, in Beijing, right? Like there's those kind of doing particular types of imperial projects, producing these polylingual works and other sorts of things, training translators. And there's a long history of what I kind of think of as these synthetic projects, right? Gray, of course, has written about tons of this in Amdo. But what's most interesting to me is to sort of specify what's going on there. And for me, that there's a real like Geluk, this particular tradition that all these guys are part of in Siberia, Mongolia, and East Tibet by this time, and in Beijing, like scholastic requirement to not reject but account for competing views. So this is like coming at Jose Cabezon's written a bunch about this stuff, but I'm always seeing, and these guys are all doing philosophy in their other work, but they're using the same interpretive language as they're accounting for history. What can we prove by scriptural reference? What can we prove by the use of pramana, direct and inferential cognition, and all that, and in the sort of flush, the riot of synthetic sources that is in the view of some of these monks, there's a real turn, I think, also to eyewitnessing as another mode of scholastic knowledge. And in fact, Zawa Damdin, who's the author of the Tibetan translation of Faxian, the kind of last in these nodes before the Tibetan refugee camp, he's buttressing by appeals to Vasubandhu, the Abhidhamma and all these other works, Kalachakra and all that, as much as like a lama he knows who walked to India and must have been in that same place where Faxian was. And so that must be this place, which therefore connects the Mongols to some prophecy Buddha gave, that whole thing, right? So there's this kind of move, and so then as the 20th century kind of extends further, that appeal to eyewitnessing that had been developing is also really used in all these ultimately failed attempts for Buddhist scholasticism to respond to socialist scientism. That is really being privileged.
That's very interesting, because in the Japanese context, the Buddhist response to European science and in particular astronomy
Yes.
in the 18th and throughout the 18th and 19th century,
Mhm.
really from like 1698 to 1898 is basically arguments in the Buddhist etymology of it.
Oh yeah, interesting.
That is, it's the Buddha eye and the heavenly eye that sees the world as it really is.
Uh-huh.
And Western scientists and astronomers are only seeing through the flesh eye.
Right. Yeah.
And therefore, they don't see the world as it really is. They only see the higher stages
Yeah.
of Buddhist knowledge and part of the meditative insight.
Yeah.
And you see the tree structure of the mountain that is moving.
Yeah, exactly.
So no matter how good your telescopes are,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. You're not going to see it. And they prove that through appropriating the Western science
Yeah.
and optics to prove the law of nature of human beings. So
That's
you know,
incredible.
there's these, in the same century, similar kinds of marshaling
Yeah.
of Buddhist philosophical arguments
Yeah.
being used to argue with science and the kind of the direct experience of seeing and the etymology of vision.
Yeah.
Very
Absolutely. But then appeal to inference as well. Like Zaladamdin makes that exact same argument against science. It's in my first book. I like do this whole thing up. But then he's saying, but what those scientists don't, they're fooled by their relativist position, right? Those fools, they think the earth is round and it's rotating. How laughable, right? Because it's only through appeal to logic, to inferential cognition or valid knowledge that one can know such things as past and present, past and future lives and karma and all that, right? Like, one bucket of water is pus to a hungry ghost and is nectar to a god. I mean, this is the usual arguments, right? I mean, it goes back to Dharmakirti and these guys. But yeah, it's amazing how it's all kind of happening around the same time. That's right.
Yeah, yeah, and you've got some online questions?
Exactly, yeah, we
Please.
have one online question, from Logo Papa, doesn't ask, could you talk more about the Mongolian guy? I heard you,
Banzhou.
yeah.
Yes.
We'll go, yeah, for another 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Well, I could just say briefly, I'm sorry, yeah, I did have to kind of gloss over him a little bit. He's an interesting guy. I do give some biographical information about him in the book. Maybe what I should say is that he's an early example of what Rupin called the Buryat intelligentsia, who become like foundational for inventing like nationalism, secularism, all these like progressive modernist movements, not just in Buryatia, but also Mongolia, and also in a kind of pan-Mongolist frame that very much includes Inner Mongolians and Tibetans at a certain point before they're all meet their end in various terrible ways. So Dorje Banzarov is like an early exemplar of that, and was trained in ethnology and in philology in ways that I think are vastly understudied. Like we have a sort of like entire subfield devoted to how do they usually call it, like insider anthropologists and so on, like the first indigenous peoples who began sort of going from informants or guides to actually being practitioners of fields like which we now call anthropology or sociology or linguistics or whatever about their own communities. But the Buryats are very early on kind of managing these like Russo Eurasian worlds for all kinds of reasons, including that they can travel in ways that others couldn't. And so his college was very interesting. And if you want to read a lot about one of his major impacts, I think I mentioned in passing, but Chris Atwood has written a book called, an article called The Black Faith, which is in reference to Banzarov's dissertation, which was published and was really impactful all around the world. The Black Faith is sort of how he's talking about, what we would call shamanism, and what gets translated, well, he uses the word shamanism in Russian. And as I said, Chris Atwood laments that it's Banzarov who actually introduces the concept of shamanism as a sort of substrate, indigenous substrate that is always below the sort of foreign Buddhism of the Buryats, Mongols, and even the Tibetans, and so on. So it's kind of like dichotomy of global, like big tradition, small tradition kind of stuff that gets into comparative religion, and which we still struggle not to reproduce in our classes and religious studies departments. But Chris Atwood has a great article on Dorji Banzarov, and there's a much more biographical info in the book, but maybe I should stop there. But he's really important.
Yeah, and there was a whole group of these guys, right? I
There
remember
were.
encountering it first through Anya Bernstein's dissertation.
Yes.
And I don't know how much it ended up in her first book, but
Absolutely.
it just kind of blew my mind.
Yeah.
It's like Nicole Willick's work on, it's 50 years later
Yeah.
when the Tibetans are showing up in the beginning, kind of
Absolutely.
brought into the social science of China's apparatus to think about Tibet. So, well, I think, Lauren, our time is up. I mean, I have more questions. I mean, you've talked to to our graduate students who in our own publication here, you've talked about the kind of decolonization of Tibetan studies, but in this kind of anti-field, I mean, you're kind of anti-Buddhist, you're taking on Buddhist studies, but I think I would love to hear, and I'm not sure we have time for this, but I'd love to hear how, you think we should, apply the anti-field to regional studies or to Tibetan studies. And I know that you, like Johan, are you've already blown apart Tibetan studies because you're coming at Tibetan studies from the Mongol side of things. But I think this could really apply to regional studies and Tibetan studies. And I think we need to hear more of it, or we need to keep hearing it again and again, because it's only people like Janet Gatso who start to kind of look at the empiricism, and the eyewitness.
Yes.
And I remember when she was working on her book about Tibetans actually looking at the body, and as sky burials were happening.
Yes.
I was telling her about the Japanese were also looking at the actual physical body and saying, hey, this doesn't match with what Buddhism says or what received sources. So there's some interesting connections that this circulatory
Absolutely.
work that you're doing, I think. But the Weatherhead does want us out of here. And I think maybe we should just closing remarks if you have any.
Well, there will be no wisdom, but the thing that's exciting for me in thinking this way is, a book that was really important for me was Wael Halak's Restating Orientalism. He's in New York somewhere, I don't know where, but he's here at Columbia, right? Okay, well, I really hope to meet him, because that book for me was very important, because it's basically saying this. We pointed to the sort of legacies, colonial and Orientalist and Christian legacies, and all the conceptual apparatus we use in all of our fields, the privileging of, certain models of Enlightenment-derived models of time and agency and place, and the national subject and civilizational modernism, and the West, non-West. We know these are there. We've been pointing out them forever. But the point is, what is the absolute, kind of fundamental, kind of epistemic substrate there that we need to overcome, and not just continue to reproduce the same thing as we do as we commit acts of history against Buddhist Asia, as I tried to say in the book. And the point is that I think we need to wildly diversify our models of time and agency, that we need to allow dissonance and disparate voices in the scholarship. We need to implicate ourselves, fundamentally our own space of analysis in the text. And there's so much to learn. We don't need to invent the wheel. We just need to read stuff in sister disciplines like Indigenous studies, Black study especially, that are doing that work. Read stuff on, say, Saidiya Hartman's work on the Black Atlantic. Read stuff on, Indigenous communities and counter histories in Canada by Indigenous studies scholars. You know what I mean? The work's done, and it's wild. It's dissonant. It's about entire chorus of views and positions that has all kinds of discipline. We can allow our disciplines to be troubled. That's the whole point. And going back to Michel de Certeau and looking down from the World Trade Center, this is his whole point. We ourselves are present in the history we tell without question. We can still do history. This was his point. He's writing against the sort of idea that all history is just a language game and history is dead and all that. He's saying, no, we can tell stories. We can just be honest. These are encounter narratives. And we can be honest and humble in them. And we can also allow our sources to bite back. That's what he says. And demand their treatment in ways that, and not just pushing Buddhist Asia through a Leibnizian frame or through an area studies frame. I don't know what that looks like, but the whole point is like, let's start experimenting and see, not just naming these legacies. Let's start the doing of the humanities that maybe gets outside of them a bit. So that's, I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I would like to thank Weatherhead for providing this space and publicity support, and Lauren for organizing and running all the machinery that makes this visible, and this will be posted online as well. So
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you.